Okay, probably pressing too many buttons now. So in simple terms, I describe sentientism as being a broad philosophical platform or a worldview, very much like humanism, that, again, like humanism, is committed to using evidence, applying reason, and having a broad moral consideration. The key difference from humanism here, and we can come back to this conversation, is really not around applying evidence and reason and having a naturalistic worldview. It's suggesting that our moral consideration, our compassion, if you like, should be extended to all sentient beings. And a statement that their existence and their experience of suffering and flourishing, their well-being, is really what matters morally at the center of a naturalistic moral worldview. So in that context, it's trying to answer the two deepest philosophical questions in the same way humanism is. What's real? Well, we don't know, but we should use evidence and reason to find out. What matters morally? We should have moral consideration for all sentient beings, or beings capable of suffering. So the story on the right-hand side is really how you might get to that point of view, starting from scratch through a personal journey that doesn't have any supernatural trappings to it. So you and I experience sentience. That's what's happening to us moment to moment, and we experience suffering, which I define as any bad experience, anything from physical pain through to existential angst and loss. And we also experience flourishing, which again I define as any of the good stuff, right? So physical pleasure, love, a sense of connectedness, any positive experience. And we experience those things personally. If anything, going back to Descartes, it's one of the things that we're most confident of is that whether we're living in a simulation or not, we are experiencing something, and that has importance to us. But I think if we look around naturalistically, we can also reason based on evidence that other beings are sentient too. And it's hard to be 100% confident, but I think using various different rules of inference and different sources of evidence, we can build a level of confidence that other beings, human or otherwise, are sentient too. And we can also use that evidence and reason to infer and guess that just as I experience suffering as a negative thing and flourishing as a positive thing, that other sentient beings do in the same way. And while a supernatural morality defines good and bad in terms of a list of rules or by the essence of a deity or some other supernatural force, when we put aside supernatural bases for morality, to me, almost definitionally, morality is about a concern for others. And that concern for others really is about their experience, the quality of their experience, whether they're suffering or they're flourishing. So in that sense, we sort of jump across the is-ought boundary and say that if morality is anything, it really is a concern for the experiences of others. And here, by others, I mean any sentient being, any being that has the capacity for a subjective experience of suffering and flourishing. So that's a sort of quick summary of what it is in a nutshell, which hopefully makes sense. But I think I'll fill out some of the details as we talk about the heritage of it, where it's come from, and some of its implications as we go through. But as I say, if anything's not clear, feel free to jump in. So this is trying to tell a story of where sentientism came from, I guess, and there's no dates on here, but you can get a sense of how these different schools of thought or philosophies or ways of thinking relate. And I've organized it by those two central questions: what should we believe is real and what should we care about morally? And in the what to believe, again, there's a 100% overlap really between sentientism and humanism, because both they start from a naturalistic point of view, one that says, reality is all there is. We have imperfect means of perceiving and thinking about it, but ultimately, provisionally and probabilistically, we can build beliefs about the nature of reality by engaging with reality and testing it. When you apply that naturalism to the field of the supernatural and to the religious, that leads you to atheism in simple terms, because there isn't good evidence to support the existence of a deity. So, if you choose therefore not to believe in the existence of deities, you're an atheist. But that doesn't imply anything about morality, what's good or bad, or any other value systems. It's really just the absence of a belief. So in simple terms, and this was in a way the path I followed, grew up in a sort of gentle, boring Christian background, but became an atheist in my teenage years for various reasons. And then I think, like, you know, many humanists, layered on a humanist compassion, a universal compassion for all other humans, regardless of their characteristics, that leads you to humanism. So that's, you know, certainly the flow of thinking that I followed to get to humanism. But then there's another school of thought and field of thought on the left-hand side of this diagram, which is trying to answer the question, what should we care about? What matters morally? What's the raw material of morality, if you like? And the thinking on the left-hand side, and again, this has deep ancient heritage, is starting to think, hold on, it's not just humans that suffer. It's not just humans that have experiences. You know, shouldn't we have a moral concern, a compassion, a consideration for non-humans as well? So there are different forms of concern for non-human animals and ethics that go deep into many aspects of global history. So if you look at the origins of Jainism, Buddhism, Rastafarianism, Arab philosophy, and some ancient naturalistic philosophies, there are many well-known thinkers who, even in those very early stages, were thinking quite seriously about granting consideration to non-humans and thinking about why we should do that and whether we should do that. So there's a rich heritage there. I guess in a modern Enlightenment context, people like Jeremy Bentham brought that into sharp focus, and many of you will have heard his famous quote where he says, you know, what matters isn't whether an entity, a being, can talk or can reason or anything else really. What matters is, can they suffer? And in a way, that statement is the essence of sentience and sentientism, the capacity to experience suffering, to feel and experience something that is qualitatively bad, really is the defining characteristic of sentience. So Jeremy Bentham and others started to zero in on sentience, although he didn't use the term, as a characteristic that would drive our moral consideration. That got formalized much more in this bubble I'm calling sentiocentrism, which really is a stance that says all sentient beings, any being capable of suffering or flourishing, should get our warrant our moral consideration. And that was developed through a lot of modern animal rights philosophy and thinking. And you'll know of people like Peter Singer, and maybe less known, but also very important in this field, Richard Ryder. And these guys actually were the first to use the term sentientism to describe not just a sentiocentric view that said we should have a moral circle that includes all sentience, but also to frame it in a more naturalistic stance. So both Peter Singer and Richard Ryder were actually describing this way of moralizing in a non-supernatural way. But the animal ethics movements and animal ethics philosophy have really ended up seeing sentiocentrism and sentientism as two fairly synonymous terms. They haven't really been clarified or distinguished from each other. So what I've been trying to do in the last couple of years, with some kind support from Peter Singer and Richard Ryder, is to really link these two themes of thought together and say, on the left here we have a moral concern for all sentient beings. In the center we have this naturalistic view that says, not just when we're thinking about our moral circle, but actually in every respect of our lives, we should take a naturalistic approach, and to refine this term sentientism as the combination of the two, hence a naturalistic commitment to evidence and reason, and a compassion universally, not just for all humans, but for all sentient beings. You then get into some slightly weirder stuff on the right-hand side. So you'll be quite familiar with those schools of thought in the center and on the left. But if what we are trying to do here is, instead of thinking about which species should we care about, or which particular characteristics should we have, if we're saying in all of that field of view, what really matters is sentience, this capacity for subjective experience, suffering and flourishing matters. That's really the raw material of our moral concern. Why should it necessarily stop with biological entities? Humans and most non-human animals are clearly sentient. But what about, at least as a thought experiment, you could imagine artificial intelligences or robots or even alien species of some sort demonstrating a level of confidence they're sentient as well. So this, to most sentientists, feels like a bit of intellectual frippery and a distraction, because they are understandably focused on the welfare of, you know, the 8 billion human sentients and the many trillions of animal sentients that really do actually exist today. And most people don't think that sentient aliens or artificial intelligences do exist. But I think it's quite interesting to consider that right-hand side, because it helps make this idea of sentientism future-proof. Because if in the future we do create or encounter other forms of sentience that aren't, you know, operating on a biological substrate, you know, why not? Why wouldn't we extend our moral consideration to them? So hopefully that gives you a sense of the different forms of sort of heritage of thinking that feed into this concept of sentience. And as we talk about a lot in humanism, you know, this is not just an Enlightenment invention. It's not just something that's come up out of Western culture. Naturalism, as I've already said, the animal ethics side has deep ancient roots in many cultures. And as we know as humanists, the naturalistic and humanistic schools of thought, again, have deep ancient roots that often predate most modern religions as well. So as with humanism, I'm keen to emphasize that this is not some new modern invention. While the term might be quite new, actually the thinking that goes into it is ancient and deep and very global indeed. So there's a slightly different view here, which is really trying to compare and contrast sentientism with some other schools of thought or other philosophies. And we've talked already about atheism, humanism, and sentientism and that distinction there. And one thing I think we'll come back to later is, encouragingly, humanism itself is already thinking about the salience of other sentient beings. If you go to the Wikipedia page for humanism, it doesn't mention non-human animals at all. It seems a completely 100% anthropocentric philosophy. But obviously Humanists UK and Humanists International have updated their definitions to include a concern for other sentient beings as well. So that's arguably, you know, blurring the line between humanism and sentientism. But I do think it's still fair to say that the center of humanism, the clue is in the name, is humans, whereas the center of sentientism is all sentient beings, including humans. So there are some challenges to sentientism. Some people say it goes too far. We should only care about humans. Of course, some people say, you know, their moral consideration is limited to certain subgroups of humans, and that leads to many of the forms of, you know, unpleasant discrimination that we're still working through as a human species at the moment. But there's also a challenge from the other side. And if you look across to the left, you'll see eco and biocentrism go even wider than sentientism. So whereas sentientism says we should have moral compassion for all sentient beings, which in simplistic terms is humans and non-human animals, eco and biocentrism says you're not going far enough. We should actually grant direct moral consideration to plants and to trees and to rocks and rivers and ecosystems and the environment and maybe the planet as a Gaia sort of system as well. So that suggests not just that we should see those things as instrumentally important because of their value to sentient beings, but that we should directly and intrinsically grant moral consideration to those entities as well. Whereas sentientism would say they're really important, but only because they're critically important to the sentient beings that can actually suffer, whereas a river or a rock or a plant, you know, can't experience anything. Where else should we go? On the right-hand side, there are a range of different views. Animalism extends humanism to all animals, but there's a slight difference with sentientism in that we also consider the theoretical possibility of non-biological or non-animal sentience. There's a form of sentientism called painism that was developed by Richard Ryder, which focused more on suffering, the imperative of reducing suffering, whereas sentientism, while most sentientists are very focused on suffering reduction, do also acknowledge the positive upside, the moral benefit of flourishing and well-being as well. And obviously, it's very much in the public gaze at the moment in veganuary and so on, and the increasing acceptance and prevalence of veganism. But there are some differences between veganism and sentientism as well, in that many vegans have a supernatural or a mystical or a magical or a spiritual worldview, and sentientism, like humanism, is explicitly naturalistic. And there are also some slight differences around the boundaries, because the definition of veganism is really about animals as a biological taxonomy, whereas sentientism says, well, it's not necessarily all about animals, it's about any being that is sentient. So these are minor differences, but if you look at something like a sea sponge, for example, it's classed as an animal, but it has no nervous system at all. So I would suggest it's not sentient, so it doesn't warrant direct moral consideration. So there's some differences around the edges about which entities we have compassion for. But in reality, most ethical vegans really use animals just as a shortcut for beings that are able to suffer. So there's an enormous overlap there as well. Transhumanism is a fascinating movement. And again, it shares some links to sentientism, and that it's a movement of people who are thinking unashamedly and directly about the capacity for modern technologies to radically enhance the quality of our experience as humans, but also potentially longevity as well. So in a sense, there's an appreciation of the value and the quality of sentience, and a scientific naturalistic approach to working out whether we can enhance and extend that as well. And while many transhumanists, like the philosopher David Pearce, also extend their moral consideration to include all other sentience, many transhumanists, again, the clue is in the name, are very narrowly focused on the human species, and sometimes even a sort of elite group of humans within them who are lucky enough to benefit from those technologies. So there's some interesting links, but again, some very strong differences too. But again, this is one of my hesitations about popularizing sentientism, is there are too many isms already, so I won't drag you through any more. But hopefully, again, background reading, and I've written some articles. There is a link at the bottom which compares and contrasts how these different isms are different from each other. That might be interesting background reading. Now, this is one of the busy slides, and so I apologize for that. But again, it's one that's, I think, is quite interesting to work through, because it helps to crystallize where some of these differences are. So the structure here really is, on the left-hand side, I've got a bunch of different types of entities. So we have the animals at the top, humans, what I've called charismatic wild animals, companion animals, like the rescue puppy at my feet, farmed animals, other wild animals that you might group into different categories. We have plants, we have environment, so again, rocks and rivers and ecosystems, and even the concept of artificial and alien intelligences. So if you like down the left, there's your menu of which types of entities might you choose to care about morally. And as we go across, I'm suggesting how some of the different worldviews might categorize those entities, and which of those items from the menu might get picked for direct moral consideration. And the critical column here really is the question, is it sentient? And sentientism doesn't have a list of species or a list of entities that count as sentient. Like humanism, it's just naturalistic. So it says follow the science, which means that we should recognize that our views about which types of entities are sentient will probably never be perfect. We're never 100%. They should always be probabilistic, based on the quality of the evidence. They should be provisional, so we should always be open to new evidence. So if we do find out that plants are able to process information in a way that implies they're sentient, fine, let's be open-minded about that possibility. But also that we should probably be reasonably prudent, given we're deciding which entities have moral consideration. It's a deeply important question. So provisional, probabilistic, and prudent beliefs. But what I've done here is to summarize the consensus state of modern science about which of these types of entities are sentient, which in short is humans and a broad swathe of other types of animals. So mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, many of the invertebrates, certainly the more complex ones like octopuses. And there's still more research required over the really simple invertebrates. Some of the very simple insects, is an open question. And there may not be a binary call we can take, like many useful concepts, life, well-being, sentience, they may well have fuzzy boundaries that we need to be prudent around. But the current consensus of science is that, sea sponges, as an example of a non-sentient animal, don't experience anything, but also plants don't either. They have complex behaviors, they can even communicate, but they don't have the information processing capacity to be sentient, so we don't think they have a subjective experience. And rocks and rivers and ecosystems and so on, they may well be important to us, but they don't suffer, they don't experience in their own right. And who knows about sentient AI and aliens, maybe we'll get there. So the default really, I guess, is the sort of average Western human, if you like. And I think most humans will grant moral consideration to humans. As we know, we've got plenty of work still to do on various forms of discrimination, dangerous discrimination within the human race, which is why I've said only subgroups, because that's still a problem we're working on. But at least in concept, after the Second World War, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you know, most people, at least in concept, would sign up and say, you know, all humans warrant moral consideration, regardless of other characteristics. Companion animals also get a green tick from most people. So, you know, the puppies and cats and other animals that we share our homes with, I think nearly everybody would grant them direct moral consideration, would see needlessly causing them harm as a moral negative. When you go out into the wild, things get more interesting, because many people have a deep appreciation for what I've called here charismatic wild animals. So, you know, the lions, the tigers, the dolphins, the gorillas, the orangutans, the ones lucky enough to star in our nature documentaries. Many people will grant a moral consideration for them and will see causing them harm or suffering as a moral negative. But even there, I've left it as a question mark, because it somewhat depends on what the context is. And for the average person, the reason they grant some value to those charismatic wildlife is, to be honest, because they enjoy watching them and they enjoy having the experience of being with them in nature, not necessarily because they actually grant moral value to those beings themselves. For other wild animals, it's normally just a cross in the box, to be honest. I think if you're not a charismatic wild animal, most humans don't really grant you serious moral consideration at all. That seems to be true for farmed animals as well. And again, there's an interesting cognitive dissonance here, where I think most, you know, the average human in reality would actually grant moral consideration to a farmed animal, but certainly in practical terms, our decisions and our behavior implies that there is practically zero moral consideration for farmed animals, given not just the way they're treated, but the fact that the industry they are a part of has their suffering and death as the very essence of the products that are produced. So that's a sort of guess at, you know, the average person and how they might grant moral consideration. Now, with a humanist, a default humanist, I've sort of taken away that only subgroups point, and I've said, look, a humanist almost by definition grants universal compassion to all humans, so that's a green. But I don't think the average humanist really varies that much from the average non-humanist in terms of granting moral consideration to non-humans. But again, we can discuss that, and I think that's shifting over time. As you move across, a vegan would take the next step, where they would normally grant moral consideration to farmed animals, which is why they would abstain from participating in or purchasing or using any form of animal origin products to the extent that's practical or possible. They'd of course shared that compassion for companion animals. They would share a compassion for charismatic wild animals. But there's an interesting wrinkle here as well, in that even many vegans who are viscerally opposed to animal farming still don't grant full moral consideration to some wild animals. So some vegans will say, you know, animal farming should be brought to an end, but if there are animals suffering in the wild, because that's part of nature, it's not something we should engage in, have moral consideration for. It's natural, we should just let it take its course. So even a default vegan, you know, there's a question mark there about whether they really grant moral consideration for other wild animals. A sentientist goes the next step: humans, charismatic wild animals, companion animals, farmed animals, but actually would say all other wild animals also get moral consideration. That doesn't mean intervening in the wild is an easy thing to do. It means there are dangers, there are difficulties, there are problems that we may not be able to solve, but at least every sentient being, wild or farmed or human, charismatic or not, invasive, vermin, whatever the characteristics, whatever the context, they still get moral consideration from a sentientist point of view. And that doesn't mean that harming or even killing them in some circumstances might not be morally required or justified, but at least they have moral consideration in the decision and in the thinking that goes into what we choose to do. And again, a sentientist technically at the bottom end there, if we do come across artificial or alien intelligences that seem to be sentient, we would grant moral consideration too. A strict biocentrist would again add some ticks, because they would grant moral consideration to plants, direct moral consideration. And an ecocentrist would go even further, and they're actually saying, look, even a rock, even a river, even a species, even an ecosystem should get direct moral consideration as well. But rather, cheekily, and this might annoy some of the environmentalists amongst us, but the actual default biocentrist, or the default environmentalist, or the default ecocentrist, while they say they have a broad moral consideration for the environment as a whole, sentient or not, most environmentalists still exclude, in practical terms, the non-charismatic wild animals and farmed animals from their consideration. So in a way, they've moved their moral circle super broad to encompass a sort of Gaia view of ecosystems as a whole, but still will conveniently carve out farmed animals, for example, from the moral consideration. So hopefully that's a useful, it's a bit busy, but hopefully gives you a sense of this central question of which types of beings warrant our moral consideration. That's at the heart of sentientism, and is the key difference between, or the refinement between, humanism and sentientism. So I've laid out here some of the best arguments against sentientism, and some of these responses are a little bit trite because I've just squeezed them into a slide, so they may look a little bit dismissive. But in simple terms, the responses and challenges to sentientism, firstly, are all of the challenges we get as humanists. So religion and revelation, reason is flawed, you can't get an ought from an is, all of the usual challenges that we might get from people with a supernatural moralistic stance, or one that doesn't accept we should grant moral consideration to all humans. But we then also have a range of different challenges to sentientism about why we should go beyond humans to non-sentience. So those include, is sentience too vague a concept to base our morality around? There are questions about the boundaries of sentience, and do we need to draw a strict line, or can it be fuzzy? There are questions about, degrees and hierarchies, and even if we do grant moral consideration to all sentience, should that be equal, or should we have degrees and hierarchies, and can humans still have a special role within that? And without drawing you through all those examples, I'll sort of leave you to look at them. But I think these are some of the things that might come up in the conversation as you question and challenge what I'm putting forward here. So while evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings sounds really, really simple and basic, in the same way as a humanist definition of evidence, reason, and compassion for all humans might, as with humanism, sentientism can actually have some quite radical implications as well. So I've written a couple of articles and laid out here some examples of the sorts of things, if you switch to a universe where all 8 billion humans were not just humanists, but were sentientist, what sort of things would be different in the world? And many of the things I've listed here, I think, are entirely consistent between, I guess, a humanist view of where the world might end up and a sentientist view of where the world might end up. So we'd see, hopefully, a reduction and then an end to different forms of discrimination: sexism, homophobia, caste, transphobia, racism, all the ones we're used to. But sentientism would add a couple as well. It would say we'd see an end to discrimination based on species, and maybe even an end to a discrimination based on substrate. So again, it's stretching the humanist idea to another level. I think, as with humanism, sentientism also has, I think, a constructive role to play in a lot of the ongoing culture wars around identity politics, intersectionality, and equality. And that I think both humanism and sentientism can step into that debate and say, we need to respect the radical diversity of perspectives, lived experiences, different group identities that are really important to individuals. But let's at the same time recognize that what we do share our humanity, we do share our sentience, we have, always imperfectly, but the ability to understand enough about each other to be able to cooperate and collaborate and work together. So I think, just as with humanism, sentientism has a positive role to play, stepping into that debate and trying to take a more universal, constructive approach than some sometimes do. There are many different forms of harm. So again, as with humanism, sentientism sees needlessly causing harm to any sentient being as a moral negative. And many of the harms we see in the world are justified by supernatural or poorly founded ethics. So whether these are constraints or harsh punishments that are justified by religion, tradition, culture, or any other sort of ethics that are not well founded in evidence and reason. I think, again, humanism and sentientism would share a very similar list of things we'd ultimately like to see disappear from the world in terms of cruel and harsh punishments and unwarranted restrictions on personal freedom and behavior. Obviously, a difference here is when you come to animal farming and the exploitation of animals. So in a sentientist utopia, there would be no animal farming and there would be no exploitation of animals. So our agricultural system would switch completely to plants, clean meats and plant-based products that don't directly cause suffering to animals. So that's, I guess, one radical policy difference. But again, most of these other things, again, are in common with humanism and sentientism. It has implications for certain forms of politics and government. So I think a sentientist or a humanist stance around government would respect individual freedoms, or would it have an egalitarian stance, naturally would lead you to something that's secular, democratic, and so on, as you'd expect, to respect those different perspectives and to try and work collaboratively to reduce harm. So in a way, that would, you'd expect that to rule out theocracies, fascism, negative forms of nationalism, and some of the other types of things I've listed here. So again, I'm not going to drag you through the rest of it, because a lot of the, the other things on that list, I think a humanist and a sentientist stance would share that these are challenging or negative things in the world that are ultimately in our utopian vision we'd like to see fade away. And you can think about how that might be instantiated. On the right, we're into a broad conversation about how social change happens. So that can happen through individual choices. So, whether it's as a consumer or an influencer, as a decision maker, as a leader, as a voter, as a campaigner, as an advocate. Again, humanists and sentientists alike can drive change through those individual decisions. Often the real power is actually at an institutional level. So you can think of corporate policies, NGOs, or government laws, regulations, and policies at various levels that could instantiate a more sentientist worldview that's trying to reduce the harm caused to sentient beings as well. And where you might imagine that leading is, I guess, a sentientist casts to many different domains of human life. And you can think about, if we really do extend our moral consideration beyond humans, what would that do to our language, the way we talk? What would that do to our justice system? What would it do to our politics? There's some fascinating thinking going on about how you could actually integrate the opinions and the views and the preferences of non-humans even into our current political systems. Would you see things like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, being rewritten and recast to take into the account the sentient animals in the wild and in farms? And would you maybe see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be upgraded to a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights? So again, I think it's similar to humanism in that many people might read the basics of humanism and go, well, it's sort of obvious, but the implications are radical. The same is true of sentientism. You might read it and think, well, that's sort of obvious, and I do feel compassion for animals, so I'm there already. But when you think about really driving those implications in clear terms into institutional policies and into individual decisions, I think you have a radically different view of where the world might get to. So hopefully that gives you an indication of, obvious to many, yet actually quite radical. And there's a couple of examples I've laid out here. So I won't draw you through this, but you'll all be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, another important milestone in, humanity's halting, ever imperfect attempt to try and make the world a better place. But as you read through many of these, if you, again, shift that worldview and say, look, let's not just think about humans, let's think about all sentient beings now. Two things happen. One is you recognize that extending that moral concern isn't really a trade-off. We're not saying let's deprecate humans and human needs and interests because we want to favor non-human sentient beings. Actually, if we extend our moral consideration and moral concern and compassion to non-humans, that ends up being a win for us as well. And many of the topics are around climate change, antimicrobial resistance, zoonotic infectious diseases, very much on our minds at the moment. All of those types of topics help us understand where, if we did have a broader compassion for non-humans, that would actually be great for us humans too. And I think that's very similar to the humanist argument. As people resisted, pushing back on racism and sexism and homophobia and, and slavery, the people resisting that change were saying, look, this is a trade-off, I'm going to lose out. But the answer from a humanist perspective is, no, as you get more generous with your compassion, you also benefit. And I think the same is true of the human species as a whole, as we get more generous with our compassion, stretching beyond that. The second thing that happens, one, is that you recognize that if we broaden our compassion, it actually makes it much more likely we'll be able to achieve these sustainable goals for human purposes, that we also need to tune and adjust the motivation behind these sustainable development goals, because we've now got a new group of trillions of non-human sentients that we need to take direct consideration for as well. And there's another example which more radically actually rewrites the Sustainable Development Goals to collapse some of these views about discrimination and protection to include non-human sentience as well as human sentience. But I'll leave you to read that at your leisure. Another interesting thought experiment, obviously the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a major humanist milestone after the Second World War. And people challenged that at the time and challenge it now and say, look, we're still not there. It's not perfect. There are trade-offs. It's difficult. Yeah, fine. But it was such an important thing to lay out and set out, even as an aspiration, even though we still haven't achieved the delivery of those human rights universally. We're a long, long way from it, but it's still a really important milestone in the development of humanity as a whole, to at least acknowledge in concept that these rights should be there. So as a thought experiment, I worked through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and again, just reset my mind to say, instead of just thinking about humans and what humans need, what would this document look like if we genuinely considered all different types of sentience as well? And it was an interesting experience, because while with some of the more esoteric rights, when you think about culture or science or, rights to work and so on, there are clear differences between what human interests and needs are and our capabilities and those of other non-humans. But actually, for the most important rights we're talking about here, the ones that actually humans see as the most fundamental and foundational, we share them all with every sentient being. So the rights to exist, to continue to live, to be free from physical harm, to have sustenance, all of the things that as humans we see as the most foundational human rights are actually the ones that are most broadly shared across all sentient beings as well. So as I went through the exercise of actually, and you can have a read and feel free to criticize the redrafting I've done, it was actually remarkably easy to recast it just with a broader moral circle. But again, this would have radical implications for policy and individual behavior at many different levels. So let me talk about who sentientists are. It's quite a new term. It was first used in 1977. I think for the last 30 years, almost nobody had ever heard of the term outside of the animal ethics and philosophy and animal advocacy movements. And even there, it wasn't really widely used. So it's a reasonably new term and quite a niche term. But if you put the definition to a side and say, look, not many people have heard of this word, but how many people think this way already? It's quite interesting to think about how many people out there have this worldview without necessarily being aware of the term. So, it's sort of silly estimates really, but if you think about maybe 10% of the world's population being atheists, which might imply a broader naturalistic worldview, and if you think about 10% are ethical vegetarians or vegans as a proxy for concern for sentient animals, a combination of those two percentages would imply, there are tens of millions of people who do have a worldview that's committed to evidence and reason and a compassion for all sentient beings. But actually, interestingly, I think the number's probably higher than that, because anecdotally, it seems that humanists and atheists are more likely than the general population to be ethical vegans. And more people who are ethical vegans and vegetarians are actually more likely to have a humanistic or an atheistic and naturalistic worldview than the general population as well. And I think that overlap is because once you are committed to a naturalistic worldview, evidence and reason, it's very hard to avoid the implication that through that scientific worldview, you have to understand the nature of our own sentient experience and its moral salience. And it's very difficult to avoid the implication, following the science, that other forms of being also suffer in a very similar way, and that should also have moral consideration. So I think there's a natural synergy between those two fields of view, the what's real, the naturalism, and the what matters, this sphere of moral concern. And it's interesting to see who, some of the sentientists are. So the people I've listed here: Diana Fleischman, who gave the Darwin Day lecture for Humanists UK a couple of years ago, Peter Singer himself, Richard Ryder, George Church, the father of modern biosynthesis, Alistair Cochrane, the author A.J. Jacobs, David Pearce, a well-known philosopher, Mike Nugent, who is the president of Atheists Ireland, for example. So there's a number of people who are already explicitly identifying this way and saying, yep, that's me. Many of them still say they're a humanist as well, but like me, they'd say they are also a sentientist. But I think there's also some interesting, academic thinkers, but also some celebs out there who think this way as well. So whether you look at Greta Thunberg, Tandy Newton, Michaela Cole, the list goes on, Ricky Gervais, you can find a surprising number of people who share this combination of a naturalistic worldview and a broad compassion for sentient beings, often reflected in their ethical veganism, that are out there. So it feels like there's a sort of latent group of people out there. I've been working for the last couple of years just to refine and recast this philosophy. So I've done some non-academic writing about it and discussing it, but I've also been trying to build some nascent global communities around it as well. And they are all open to anyone interested in these ideas. So we have people in there of all walks of life and backgrounds, religious and not, and with different views on human and animal ethics as well. And that it remains, a niche topic, but we have, a few thousand people involved in these different groups across, I think, about 103 different countries at the moment. But yeah, they're open to anybody interested. So I don't really have a view as to where this is going to go. There's no organization, there's no money, there's no governance, there's no structure. It's just a worldview that may or may not be useful to people as they think about how to try and take more moral decisions. But it seems to be tapping into some very timely ethical themes and trends around animal ethics, around the environment, around a need for naturalism, around the challenges of religious and supernatural worldviews, but more broadly around a need for us to commit to using evidence and reason and naturalism in all swathes of life, whether that be politics, personal life, or more obviously ethical considerations. We have a wall of sentientists on our website where people are adding personal messages and saying, this is why I'm a sentientist. So if you want a more personal perspective on why people think this philosophy resonates, then you can click on there and go read some of those messages. We've got a few celebs sprinkled in there as well, as you can probably see from some of the pictures you might recognize. And at the back end here, really, there's just some further reading and also some proper authors who've written books that touch on many of the themes I've talked about here. So hopefully those will be food for thought if you're interested in the topic. And I will probably leave it there. I've been blathering on for